All right, welcome back to another episode of Robby's Recommended Reading. Today, I want to talk about J. Michael Straczynski's Amazing Spider-Man run. Now, this is one of the more controversial runs in modern comics, and maybe in all of Marvel Comics history, because JMS took Marvel's flagship character and changed both his past and his future in some pretty significant, often unpopular ways. And I say this because if you've heard of this run before, you might have heard some negative things about it, particularly about something called Sins Past and another story called One More Day. And look, I am not here to defend either one of those stories. I don't necessarily think they're the worst stories about Spider-Man ever written, but they're not too far from that. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why are you recommending this run then, Robby? And that is a great question. I'm recommending this because apart from those stories, which I know is, quite the concession, this is one of my favorite runs I've come across in the last few years. And it's up there with Ultimate Spider-Man and with the Daredevil run I was talking about last episode as just being one of these nearly perfect moments in comics for me. And I wanted to talk a bit about why that's the case. So if you're interested, the way that I would recommend reading this run is in these two big volumes. And I'll show you the first one here, and then I'll get to the second one here in a moment. This volume basically covers the portion of JMS's run that he did in collaboration with John Romita Jr., who has also done some work on Daredevil. And if you look, actually, this hardcover here, if you take the slipcover off, is all John Romita Jr.'s art, and I'm a huge fan of that. And that's actually a big part of what I love about this run in general, is it kind of gives this sort of classic look to Spider-Man that I love. And as you see here, it gives a lot of attention to Peter and MJ's personal life in a way that I think has become pretty rare and maybe even just non-existent in the years since. And here's what I mean by that. I think Spider-Man is one of these characters that, since his inception, writers have struggled to figure out kind of how to age him, or whether to age him, or sort of how much of an adult to treat him as. And I think it's interesting that Stan Lee introduced him in high school, and by the end of just he and Ditko's run, he was already kind of getting out of high school and into college. And then I think at that point he got kind of frozen for a while, and it's difficult to figure out what to do with a character that's so defined by being the kind of angst-ridden teenager, as he's already kind of aged out of that zone. And I think that's why we had things like Ultimate Spider-Man. I think that's why we have a series like the Tom Holland Spider-Man films now. I think that a lot of writers are a lot more comfortable writing Spider-Man as a fundamentally immature character. And I understand that. However, the character has been around for a long time. And I think that in some ways that version of him, at least in the comics, is pretty played out. And what I like in this JMS run, particularly in the part here with JMS and John Romita Jr., is I love the focus on Peter as essentially a grown-up. I mean, we see him here take a job as a high school teacher. We see him living very much this everyday life in New York. It's very ground level. Even when this book gets mystical, and it does get pretty mystical, it keeps it very grounded in the way that Kyle and I always talk about, where it's at least kind of obeying the rules of the Spider-Man world, and it's keeping things in that kind of friendly neighborhood territory that I think Spider-Man really succeeds the most in, as opposed to someone like Thor or the Fantastic Four or the Guardians, who obviously really thrive on more of a cosmic kind of multiverse even level. I think as great as certain Spider-Verse type events may be. I really think Spider-Man does best when he's just kind of the everyday guy that's trying to protect the people of New York and of Queens even, whenever it's this with great power must also come great responsibility thing. And I know that there are so many great Spider-Man writers out there. And I don't want to have too many hot takes here, but in terms of the modern era of Spider-Man, I just think this is about as good as it gets. When it's great, it's great. And really, apart from those two runs that have become so infamous, it's great. Particularly in this first volume. So if you pick up this volume here, again, this is what it looks like with the slipcover off, but really from the time it starts until the point where John Romita Jr. dips out, it is this one kind of self-contained, fantastic Spider-Man story where we get some really great moments with Peter and MJ, and also with Peter and Aunt May. You may have heard about the issue dating from back in this period where Peter unmasks for Aunt May finally, and there's this really great conversation that I feel like is one of the more like emotionally resonant Spider-Man comics that I've read, and there's a lot of great character work, I guess, done in this first chunk of JMS's run. And I think, again, if you want to totally skip the Sins Past portion there at the end of that volume, you're totally fine to. I would even recommend it. It's absolutely not a story that's contributed much to Spider-Man continuity, and if anything, I think it kind of muddles it and brings some things down. And so I would have no problem telling you to steer clear of that. And after you've read volume 1, if you're still into it, then heading over to this volume 2, which you can see this run is not particularly short, but this is, again, also JMS writing. John Romita Jr. is not around for this volume. We have pretty much Mike Deodato for the bulk of it here, and also some Joe Quesada, as you can make out. So the style is a bit different. This is the period that basically covers Spider-Man joining the Avengers up through the events of Civil War, and then kind of the fallout of Civil War in the comics. It's a very different vibe from the first chunk of JMS's run, and it's much less consistently good, I would say, but the high points are really fantastic. And for me, those come particularly in the Amazing Spider-Man Civil War issues, where I actually think those are some of my favorite parts of Civil War, the comic event in general, which is, again, kind of another hot take. I'm not a huge fan of Mark Millar, who wrote the Civil War event, as much as I kind of respect what that event was. I'm a much bigger fan of the way JMS writes, and I think fans of the MCU will be pleasantly surprised to see how much of the Captain America Civil War film dialogue was ripped like straight from these Amazing Spider-Man issues, more even than the Mark Millar main Civil War issues. It is such, like, from the scenes with Spider-Man and Cap to the scene that's kind of famous now of Peter Parker unmasking at a press conference. There are just these really, really great moments that if you're a fan of the character, and if you're a fan of kind of the character at its core, I think you'll really enjoy. And maybe even more than that, to me, there's this little arc that comes after that called Back in Black, and I won't get too into that because I want to stay relatively spoiler-free here. But in the aftermath of Civil War, you see Spider-Man kind of don the black suit and go sort of on this particularly dark path, which I think, when done right, is always, again, really poignant for a character like Spider-Man, who so rarely is in that kind of space. So I think it's, like I said, not on par with that first volume for me, but again, the great moments are really, really worth reading, even to the point where I would say if you're not interested in kind of taking on this entire run, which I understand, I would definitely recommend reading those Amazing Spider-Man issues in and around the Civil War era, because I think that it's some of the best dialogues, just some of the best writing for this character that's come out in the past several decades. I know it's another hot take, but I say all this because I think for folks that are curious about where to start reading Spider-Man, there's so much out there. It's some folks are tempted to maybe start at the very beginning, work forward, and you just have to work through a lot. Not that I would recommend not doing that, but having read most of those issues, I would say the original Stan Lee stuff, kind of going into the Conway stuff, is fantastic and absolutely worth reading. After that, kind of through the 80s and 90s, it can be a bit hit or miss. I would say the Todd McFarlane stuff is really great. But if you want to start like a modern Spider-Man reading, and if you're walking to a comic book store and ask sort of where you should start, I think a lot of people might say that you should start at the Brand New Day era, which started in 2008. Right at the close of this JMS period, which was from 2001 to 2007. But I would recommend that you actually start here. And I know that's strange because this One More Day story that this volume 2 concludes with, that I said was so infamous, ends by kind of fracturing the Spider-Man continuity. And I think that's why often folks will say to start with that Brand New Day era, because it's sort of meant to be a jumping on point for fans. But I think that you, in doing that, really miss out on some great Spider-Man stories and some great character work, as I said. And I would say even with kind of the continuity break, and even if you want to brush over that One More Day story, I think it's sufficiently recapped later where it's not something that I think is required reading. I think everything else here is pretty fun and pretty great to read, also in conjunction with the other stuff that was coming out in Marvel at that time. So I know I've talked to some folks about the Bendis New Avengers series and kind of that whole Avengers arc that Bendis had going from, I guess, 2004, 2005, all the way up to 2009. He went further than that, but there's an arc that I see kind of happening there. And this is really great companion reading to that, because as I said, you see Spider-Man go in with the Avengers, and even in that volume 1, it's great almost in the opposite way, and then it's just a really self-contained, really kind of introspective approach to the character that I personally am a big fan of. So, as I've said, I would recommend this as a great jumping on point, or for someone that just likes to kind of jump into different periods of Spider-Man comics, I would recommend this as one of the highlights for me. I think that you won't be disappointed. But as always, I love to hear feedback. So if you do check this out, I would love to hear your thoughts. And if anyone has any questions on kind of the best way to read this, or any other sort of Spider-Man continuity queries, I'd be happy to answer those as well. I love nothing more than to recommend things to read and also to talk about them with folks. It's been really fun getting comments from you guys since that first Daredevil episode, and I hope that we can have some fun conversations about this as well. So go out, find the JMS Spider-Man run however you want, whether that's on Marvel Unlimited or at your local comic book store, and dive in and let me know what you guys think here at the FFW Podcast on social media, or go to the ffwpodcast.com and send us a message there. We're always happy to hear from you. In the meantime, everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you soon.